Justin stared at the empty space beside him on the couch, the cushion still bearing the slight impression of where Grace had been sitting moments before. The gentle ping of her phone had summoned her away, as it always did these days. He watched her retreating figure, hunched over the glowing screen, disappearing into another room of their home, their shared home that increasingly felt like two separate territories connected by hollow hallways. He could still remember when they'd first moved in together. How they'd stayed up all night unpacking, collapsing into exhausted laughter at 3 a.m., making love on a mattress surrounded by cardboard boxes. Grace used to look at him then. Really look at him. Her eyes dancing with a light that seemed reserved just for him. When had that light gone out? "Grace," Justin called out, his voice echoing against the walls. "I was thinking we could try that new Italian place tonight?" A few seconds passed before her distracted reply floated back. Oh, I already ate something earlier." Of course she had. Justin's carefully planned surprise date night crumbled before it had even begun. He deleted the reservation from his phone, the third one this month. He'd started keeping track of their conversations in his mind. Pathetic, he knew, but revealing. 3 days had passed since Grace had asked him anything about his day. 2 weeks since she'd initiated any physical contact. 72 days since she'd said, "I love you," without him saying it first. Justin moved to the kitchen, preparing a solitary meal while memories played through his mind like faded photographs. Grace's smile across a candlelit table on their first anniversary, her hand reaching for his during movies. The way she used to press her cold feet against his legs in bed, giggling at his protests. Now she slept, curled away from him, her phone the last thing she touched at night and the first thing she reached for in the morning. The blue glow illuminating her face in the darkness had become the most consistent source of light in their bedroom. He set his plate down at the dining table, not bothering to turn on more than one light. From somewhere in the house came the distant sound of Grace's laughter, a sound once directed at his jokes, now reserved for whatever was happening in her digital world. "When did we become strangers?" he whispered to his reflection in the window glass. Justin couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when their marriage had begun to disintegrate. It hadn't been a sudden break, but a slow erosion, a quiet tragedy of accumulated silences, declined invitations, and unreciprocated efforts. Each, not tonight, and maybe later, had been a tiny chisel, gradually sculpting the canyon that now stretched between them. He picked at his food, wondering if Grace had even noticed the growing distance, or if she simply preferred it this way. The realization that he might be the only one fighting for their marriage settled over him like a cold fog, seeping into his bones and making him feel more alone than if he actually lived by himself. In a house filled with 2 people, Justin had never felt more invisible. Justin stood back, surveying his work with nervous anticipation. The dining table, usually bare and functional, now gleamed under the soft glow of candles. He'd spent hours preparing her favorite meal, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables and that special lemon sauce she once said reminded her of their honeymoon. A bottle of the Chardonnay they'd discovered together 3 anniversaries ago stood breathing beside 2 crystal glasses, wedding gifts they rarely used anymore. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted a fork for the 3rd time. 6 months of growing distance had hollowed out their marriage, leaving them like strangers sharing a mortgage. Tonight was his attempt to bridge that void, to find the woman he'd fallen in love with somewhere in the cold, detached person Grace had become. The sound of keys in the door sent his heart racing. He quickly lit the candles and stood waiting, rehearsed words of affection stuck in his throat. "Hey," Grace said flatly, barely glancing his way as she dropped her purse on the counter. Her eyes eventually drifted to the table, registering the elaborate setup with something that looked like annoyance rather than surprise. "I made dinner," Justin said, his voice carrying a hopefulness that felt pathetic even to his own ears. Your favorite. Grace checked her phone, scrolling with one thumb. Oh, I already ate with Melissa and Jen after work. You should have texted. The words hit Justin like a physical blow. He'd mentioned his plans 3 days ago, had even sent a midday message that went unanswered. The salmon that had taken him 40 minutes to perfect suddenly looked ridiculous, a symbol of his desperation. I did text you, he said, struggling to keep accusation from his voice. I wanted tonight to be special. Well, I'm full, she replied with a shrug that dismissed not just the meal, but the entire gesture. She kicked off her shoes and moved toward the living room. You can put it away for tomorrow. Something inside Justin snapped. After months of walking on eggshells, of making excuses for her indifference, he couldn't pretend anymore. What happened to us, Grace? When did I become someone you can't even have dinner with? She turned, irritation flashing across her face. Don't make this dramatic. I'm just not hungry. This isn't about food. It's about us, about how you've completely checked out of this marriage. Look, Justin, she said with chilling calm. My body, my rules. I don't owe you dinners or anything else just because we're married. The phrase hung between them, revealing the truth he'd been avoiding. In her mind, their partnership had devolved into obligation, and she was rejecting even that. Standing amid the flickering candles, Justin finally saw clearly. Grace hadn't just eaten dinner elsewhere tonight. She'd left their marriage long ago, leaving him to dine alone with his delusions. There's a moment in every broken marriage when one person realizes that staying is a slower death than leaving. For Justin, that moment didn't come with thunderclaps or dramatic arguments. It arrived in the quiet space between heartbeats, in the hollow silence that had become the soundtrack of his marriage to Grace. Justin made his decision on a Tuesday morning. Nothing special about the day. Grace had been coldly dismissive at breakfast, as usual. But something inside him finally crumbled away. The fear, maybe, or perhaps the last desperate hope that things might change. I'm leaving, he told her that evening, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening beneath his ribs. Grace barely looked up from her phone. Sure you are, she said with that familiar edge of contempt. You'll be back by dinner tomorrow. But he wasn't. Justin walked away without dramatics or accusations. He simply packed what mattered and moved into a small apartment across town. Each step away from that house felt like shedding years of accumulated weight. The air tasted different, cleaner somehow. For the first time in years, he could breathe fully. Grace's dismissal turned to disbelief when the divorce papers arrived at her door 3 weeks later. The shock on her face when she called him would have been satisfying if it wasn't so pitiful. This is ridiculous, she hissed through the phone. You can't just throw away 5 years of marriage. They were already thrown away, he answered quietly. I'm just finally admitting it. That's when the campaign began. First came the text messages, dozens daily, alternating between vicious accusations and tearful pleas. Then she appeared at his workplace, mascara streaking her cheeks, demanding loudly that he stop this nonsense. His co-workers averted their eyes as security escorted her out. She tracked him to his gym, waiting in the parking lot for over an hour. Please, she begged, clutching his arm so tightly her nails left half moons in his skin. I'll change. I'll be different. We can go to counseling. The worst was when he found her sitting outside his apartment door one rainy evening, soaked through, makeup washed away, looking smaller than he'd ever seen her. Don't you remember how we used to be? She whispered. He did remember. That was the tragedy of it all. He remembered everything, including how thoroughly she had destroyed what they'd had with years of coldness and contempt. It's too late, Grace, he said, gentler than she deserved. You don't actually want me. You just don't want to be alone. The truth hung between them, undeniable. Her desperate pursuit wasn't about love. It had never been about love. She was chasing the comfort of having someone there, a presence to fill the emptiness she couldn't face. Justin closed his door that night with a finality that felt like both an ending and a beginning. Sometimes, walking away isn't an act of cruelty. It's the only honest choice left. The silence of his new apartment greeted Justin each evening now. At first, that silence had been deafening, a constant reminder of his failure, of the marriage that had crumbled in his hands like dry earth. The divorce papers, signed and filed, had formalized what he'd known for months. Grace was gone, and with her, the life he had carefully constructed over 7 years. Justin traced his finger along the windowsill, watching dust particles dance in the afternoon sunlight. 6 months had passed since he'd moved out of their shared home. 6 months of learning to sleep alone again, of cooking meals for one, of catching himself starting sentences with "we," only to falter mid-word. "You should call Matt and Ryan," his sister had urged during one of her weekly check-in calls. "They've been asking about you." He had nodded, promised he would, then set the phone down and returned to the comfortable numbness he'd cultivated. But eventually, he did call. And surprisingly, his old friends welcomed him back without question, without the awkward interrogations he'd feared. "The band's playing again," Matt had mentioned casually over beers. "We could use a guitarist who remembers the classics." The weight of his guitar in his hands that first practice had felt foreign, and then, suddenly, like coming home. The calluses that formed on his fingertips were physical proof of his return to himself. The self that existed before Grace had subtly, systematically convinced him that his music was just noise, his friends were just distractions. Spring melted into summer. Justin planted herbs on his small balcony. He joined a hiking group. He stopped checking Grace's social media accounts at 3 a.m. The tight knot of anxiety that had lived in his chest began to loosen, one thread at a time. Then came Maria. She sat across from him at a mutual friend's dinner party, her laugh genuine, her questions thoughtful. She didn't perform for the room the way Grace always had. Instead, she listened, truly listened, when Justin spoke about the documentary he'd recently watched, her eyes never darting around for someone more interesting to engage with. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" he asked her at the end of the evening, surprising himself with his own boldness. "I'd love that," Maria answered, her smile reaching her eyes in a way that made his heart remember how to hope. Their relationship unfolded naturally, without games or manipulations. Maria was present in a way Grace never had been, interested in his thoughts, supportive of his rekindled passions, secure enough not to view his independence as rejection. So when Grace appeared unannounced at his door 6 months later, all perfect makeup and practiced vulnerability, Justin felt nothing but a calm clarity. "I've changed," she whispered, her hand reaching for his arm. "I miss us. I miss you." Justin stepped back, creating distance that would have been impossible for him a year ago. "There is no us anymore, Grace. And the man you're looking for doesn't exist either. He never really did. He was just who you needed me to be." As he gently closed the door on his past, Justin realized he was finally free, not just from Grace, but from the shadow of himself he'd lived in for too long. The morning sun filtered through the cafe windows as Justin sat across from Maria, their coffee cups warming their hands. 3 months into their relationship, and still, each moment felt like coming home. The bell above the door chimed, and Justin's stomach tightened instantly. He'd recognize that silhouette anywhere. Grace stood in the doorway, scanning the room until her gaze locked with his. Her eyes narrowed slightly before her lips curved into that smile, the one that once made his heart race but now only triggered alarm bells in his mind. She approached their table with deliberate steps. "Justin," she said, voice honey-sweet with poison underneath. "How nice to see you out and about. It's been, 6 months since you left?" Maria looked between them, her hand finding his under the table. Justin cleared his throat. "Grace, this is Maria. Maria, this is—" "The ex," Grace finished, studying Maria with calculated intensity. "I'm surprised he's told you anything about me." "He's told me enough," Maria replied evenly. Grace's laugh was brittle. "Well, enjoy him while it lasts. Justin's good at beginnings, terrible at staying. When things get difficult, he walks away. Don't you, Justin?" The old Justin would have crumbled, would have accepted her twisted version of reality, but months of healing had given him clarity. What they'd had wasn't love. It was possession disguised as passion. "Actually," he said, voice steadier than he expected, "what I'm terrible at is staying where I'm not valued. There's a difference." Grace's expression flickered. She leaned forward, dropping her voice to a whisper. "She'll leave you too, you know, when she sees who you really are. They always do." Justin felt Maria's hand tighten around his, not in fear or doubt, but in solidarity. Without hesitation, she interlaced their fingers and placed their joined hands on the table, a silent declaration. "I see exactly who he is," Maria said. "Someone who had the courage to choose himself when it mattered most." In that moment, the contrast between his past and present stood in stark relief. Grace's love had been conditional, a transaction. Maria's was a partnership, built on mutual respect and genuine care. Grace's mask slipped, just for a second. "You've changed." "I have," Justin agreed. "Thank you for that, at least." As Grace walked away, Justin felt the last chains of his past finally break free. The weight he'd carried for years, the doubt, the fear, the feeling that he was somehow broken, lifted from his shoulders. "You okay?" Maria asked softly. Justin looked at their still intertwined hands and realized that yes, he was. Better than okay. He was free. He'd learned that love shouldn't deplete you, it should replenish. That walking away from toxicity wasn't weakness, but the ultimate act of self-preservation. And most importantly, that by reclaiming his worth, he'd created space for something authentic to grow. "You know what?" he said, smiling genuinely. "I really am.